You're dealing with the aftermath of a traumatic breakup. You're dealing with the idea that the partner that you had been with for years comes out to be a full-on malignant narcissist. The mask has fallen, and you realize, was this really ever truly love?
Welcome to the show, Michael. Really great to have you here.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to meet you for the first time, and thanks for having me.
Last week, there was a big fracas between Donald Trump and JD Vance in the White House, and it's left a lot of people wondering about where American foreign policy is going, what it means for the transatlantic alliance, what it means for the end of the Ukraine war. And you had a fantastic discussion the other day with Piotr and it's James Lindsay, is that the other chap, about that, which was called the Trump-Zelensky fiasco, the end of the West. Maybe we could just begin with your assessment of what exactly happened last week between JD Vance, Donald Trump, and Vladimir Zelensky.
We've had a week now to unpack everything with this. What I like to say is the first time that we have seen the United States throw a country under the bus in real time wasn't the first time that we've done this to countries, and it certainly will not be the last, although a lot of these things takes place behind closed doors. And then when the cameras are rolling, there's fake smiles and boilerplate statements from two heads of state standing at, two respective podiums. And, this time it sort of deteriorated very quickly into a shouting match, especially among three people with enormous egos that characterize them. I think that the instigator in all of this was, ultimately JD Vance, who, in my opinion, is really using this as a springboard for a possible run for the White House in the next 4 years. We have to remember that it was Vance about a week or two prior to that made this rather controversial speech at the Munich Security Conference. I like to say that the Munich Security Conference is remembered really for speeches that are given by heads of state that are not part of Europe. Putin in 2007, where he for the first time had said to Europe and the West, don't treat us like a supplicant, treat us like a partner, otherwise global security will be at risk, in which the West had sort of looked at this as throwing down the gauntlet. And now, 18 years later, with Vice President Vance effectively telling Europe, you either need to fall into lockstep with us or you risk being irrelevant. So it was Vance's initial statement that said, you haven't thanked the United States for all the money that we have given you. Not once have you shown any appreciation for this, which is really a talking down to a head of state. Say what you want about Zelensky. And, at this point, Zelensky is less of a person as he is an avatar. Depending upon what side of the argument you're on as far as Ukraine. If you are all in for standing with Ukraine, Zelensky is the paragon of democratic virtue, defending Europe and the West from Russia. And if you believe that Ukraine is nothing more than a proxy for a NATO conflict against Russia, then Zelensky was reminded sooner than he would have expected that he is just that he is a proxy, he is a puppet, his usefulness has served its purpose, and it's time for the war to end. Trump had said while he was campaigning last year that if he was elected, he would end the war very, very quickly. He would get Zelensky and Putin to sit down, and he would hash out some kind of agreement. This, of course, created shockwaves through Europe, because if Trump got elected, suddenly U.S. foreign policy would dramatically change. And that's exactly what happened. That is effectively what happened. But I don't think anybody expected it to be as abruptly and as loudly as that. I think what people are more reeling from is the collapse in diplomatic decorum than any real change in American foreign policy. There is, no gradual slowing down of aid. This was a plan. This was a peace proposal, which we forget. The peace proposal offered to Ukraine came with Ukraine having to give somewhere upwards of $500 billion worth of raw materials and minerals to the United States as a way of paying back all of the aid that was given. If Zelensky had signed this deal, this would have effectively given the Ukrainian economy over to the United States. Zelensky was in Washington to sign that deal. It was a very, very controversial deal. But what he was hoping to get in response was U.S. military security guarantees, of which Trump was not willing to sign on to. That was what led to the tussle, is that Zelensky was effectively saying, look, we need you. Diplomacy is more than just simply siding with Russia. Russia is the one that invaded us. And this, of course, rubbed both Trump and Vance the wrong way, to which it resulted in the shouting match, Trump telling Zelensky, you have no cards in this, you have really no role, literally know your place. And the deal, to my knowledge, had been canceled, right? Zelensky had boarded a plane. I think he was almost booted out of the White House, to which Trump said, we're not dealing with him anymore. We're not going to even think of the of any kind of deal. We'll work directly with Russia in a very weird and strange way. This may very well have saved Ukraine's economy from a Faustian bargain that would have been just utterly disastrous for the country.
That's right. And there's lots of conflicting interpretations as to whether it was like a planned stunt, I guess, or whether it was a genuine, breakdown, a sort of partly emotionally driven breakdown in the meeting, or whether it's all just a sort of distraction for, business as usual, so to speak, from the empire. And what do you think? Do you think it was a genuine breakdown?
It's hard to say in this day and age of social media. A part of me was almost wondering if this really was staged. Just because if it wasn't, this is what you see behind the scenes, but as I said, real time. Historically speaking, the United States government has admonished and talked down to many, many countries that were our erstwhile partners for something that we had wanted. There's a great book, it's now a couple of years dated, but there's a great book by Stephen Kinzer called Overthrow, which details the history of American-led regime change from the annexation of Hawaii up to the Second Gulf War in 2003. And it's just replete with information about how statesmen as high as the president, to secretaries of state, secretary of defense, to corporate leaders using heads of state of smaller countries in Central and South America, the Middle East, as pawns, right, as absolute pawns. So it's no surprise that Ukraine was being used as a pawn, as a proxy in a war that ultimately was to weaken Russia, either to the point of economic breakdown, internal uprising, even territorial fragmentation. I mean, this has been well documented among Western leaders. So as to whether or not this was real, whether this was staged, it's hard to say. What we do know is that Trump wants to end this war, not because he cares about saving the lives of Ukrainians. We've been very clear in saying that Ukrainians are doing the fighting for us. Senator Lindsey Graham, somebody who I have zero love and respect for, has said the quiet parts out loud. And not surprising, as soon as the talks had broken down, the Republican Party, including Graham, including Marco Rubio, have all fallen in lockstep with Trump and Vance, blaming Zelensky for being disrespectful, for being stupid and not signing this peace deal, which earlier they loved prolonging the war. For them, this was making money. For them, this was outsourcing, our own wars. So, it's very clear that we're not interested in saving Ukrainian lives as we are making money. And this is really the way in which you need to understand Trump's foreign policy, is that wars are bad for business, but money can be made in their reconstruction and the reacquisition of territory. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I guess beyond the media spin, but beyond the theatrics of it all, I guess my question is really, where does it place Trump's professed objective to end the war within a diplomatic process? Because at one level, you would think that it doesn't seem to really advance that objective to have alienated the proxy and the co-belligerent of the European Union and Britain in the war. So Trump seems to have declared an intent to end the war, but his strategy to end the war seems not to actually be able to be effectively negotiated with his partners, if you like.
Well, I mean, if this means Europe, it prolongs the conflict for at least, let's say, another 6 months or so. Not surprising, Zelensky, who, again, say what you want about him, but he is the head of a state of a country that has been really invaded from two sides, militarily from Russia, economically and strategically from the West. NATO is no friend to Ukraine. And we need to be very, very clear that while the West is just absolutely aghast at Trump effectively giving Putin everything that he wants, and it gives the invader, victory, and it's a very, I think, very careless narrative to suggest that Russia invaded Ukraine without any reason, absolutely unprovoked. I mean, this just absolutely ignores years of belligerent U.S.-led foreign policy that created a security dilemma right up to Russia's borders. I mean, people tend to forget that 60 or so years ago, the United States perceived this very thing on its own shores, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were ready to go to nuclear war as a result of that. And Khrushchev had been smart enough to, de-escalate this conflict. The United States is absolutely willing, according to some, and not even within the Trump administration. John Bolton, who has never met a state that he did not want to invade for American empire, I mean, is willing to start World War III and IV. So Zelensky is someone who he's absolutely beleaguered, and he has only one more card to play, and that is running to the European Union, running to the EU and Great Britain, which I'm not sure if this is a great alternative. I know that Keir Starmer is determined to, ensure that his country, the UK, has some kind of relevancy in the mid-21st century. Otherwise, it risks just becoming just another country. But whether they have the military capability, which they don't, or the financial capability to compensate for what is being lost from America, which they ultimately don't, it's kicking the can down the road. Now, in the meantime, if Trump wants to continue some sort of negotiated agreement with Russia, Ukraine will be part of that, but Trump is also interested in rolling back the sanctions, doing business with Russia. Trump sees Russia as a fellow great power in the world. Like, Trump is really somebody who believes in realpolitik, 19th century realpolitik. Great powers deal with each other, smaller powers fall in line. And so Europe is now in this position as to whether they fall in line with the United States or whether they pursue an independent foreign policy. This is now the idea that is being mused among Starmer, Merz, Macron, among others. The thing that we have to understand is that Europe does not have a united foreign policy, even if we consider the European Union as the institutional spokesperson, because it is not a united organization. It is made up of 27 sovereign states, many of which have voiced misgivings about escalating the conflict. Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia. But we also need to understand that many of the leaders that are advocating the continuation of this Western liberalist policy towards Russia are incredibly unpopular at the polls at home and run the risk of losing elections to right-wing populist governments that may not, or populist parties that might not form a government, but push the political discussion further and further away from business as usual with Russia and taking on a rapprochement. So, Europe at this point, I don't know if it has the capability of continuing this on its own because it was never designed to do this. Europe has always been told to simply follow in the footsteps of the United States. Up until Joe Biden's presidency, had he been reelected or had Kamala Harris been elected, it would have been business as usual. Trump has done a complete 180 deviation, and he doesn't care. As far as he's concerned, he just does not care.
As I understand the sort of history of the transatlantic alliance, people often talk about the Sino-Soviet split of the 60s, etc., but there's been a long-standing Euro-American fracture, at least I would say, going all the way back to the 60s. I mean, de Gaulle threw NATO out of Paris in the 60s.
Yeah.
And the 70s détente was partly about Europe's assertion of its, desire to mend its broken halves. And certainly up until the Euro, financial crisis from 2008 or so, there was a strong assertion of Europe as a pole in, Sarkozy openly talked about a multipolar world as well. Some of that talk seems to be coming back a little bit in Europe, and even the origins of the crisis in Ukraine in 2014. Victoria Nuland's famous F the EU, but there was also a major economic conflict between, Europe, Russia, and to some degree, I guess, the United States in terms of economic control of Ukraine as well. So, what practical objective do you think the EU leaders might be pursuing in this phase of the sort of negotiation of the end of the Ukraine war, and how might that be different to the US?
Well, now it's fundamentally different. The United States has taken on this role, as I said before, of dealing with great powers as such, and Europe is seen as more of a sidekick, as more of a series of followers. I mean, look, it was never a partnership. We like to always call this the transatlantic alliance, the transatlantic partnership, but a partnership presupposes a certain amount of equality, that there is parity among its members. It never was. Even between the US and the UK, it never really was. It always was a sense of asymmetrical, disproportionate interdependence. The United States relied on Europe to be, its cheering crowd, the peanut gallery. Europe looked to the United States for military security through NATO and through some form of global neoliberalism as a way of spreading, capitalist markets. What we find in the last 3 years is the United States leading the charge in advocating sanctions against Russia. And if the initial idea was to economically cripple Russia to get them to rethink their invasion of Ukraine, that failed, right? That absolutely failed. And it's not because the Russian economy is that bulletproof. It's that Putin had anticipated this years earlier and had about 8 years of preparation from 2014. We have to remember the first series of sanctions was put against Russia following the annexation of Crimea. And so when a country is sanctioned, and the literature has always said that sanctions never really work unless the country is, absolutely economically isolated. But Russia is not. You engage in all forms of import substitution, third-party maneuvering, black market, corrupt. I mean, there's all of these things, right? So Russia was ready for this, and the economy is now the largest economy in Europe. And don't forget, the strongest economy in Europe right now is Russia. So Europe is the one that is reeling from these sanctions. The prices are going up. The energy costs are going up. Nord Stream was detonated under the auspices of the US, the UK, the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, about a couple of weeks ago, proudly proclaimed that they are now switched off their connection to the electric grid, along with Russia and Belarus, as a sign of defiance. To which the rest of the world said, "Okay, fine, whatever," and costs go up. Okay, if that's the price that you want to pay for being part of the democratic alliance of European states, go ahead. But within an increasing multipolar world that Macron has rightfully acknowledged, to do this effectively and intelligently, a multipolar world requires one to work with other world powers. And you cannot do that by sanctioning Russia. You cannot do that by blocking China, right? Multipolarism, at least from a classic IR definition, is that there are 3 or more major powers within a region, whether it's a particular part of the world or the world itself. In this part, we're now really talking about global powers. And none of them have the ability of overpowering any of the others. Alliances, cooperation works, but in many cases, multipolarism requires some kind of strategic prudence. This is what Putin and Xi Jinping have been saying for years, is that the world is no longer becoming multipolar, it is. And the United States has always been a key part of that. They do not deny that. Putin has never, ever, ever denied that the United States is a major world power. But they need to think like a world power within a multipolar world. If Europe now wants to get on board this, there has to be a major discussion about whether the European Union, as a united organization, tries to become one of those, or whether individual countries like France or Germany or the UK do that. And right now, the only country that might have some ability at doing it on its own is France, right? Is France. But to do that also requires them to reestablish communication and economic ties with Russia, which is considered to be an anathema, a stigma for their foreign policy. So the leaders of the EU right now, Ursula von Leyen, the leaders of NATO, Jens Rutte, right?
Yep.
They are not tuned to this. As far as they're concerned, the big thing that drives their policies is Russophobia and this staunch, stubborn belief in liberalism combating the perceived evils outside of the European Union.
Absolutely. Do you think that's likely to change, or I mean, Jeffrey Sachs, you mentioned his speech to it was the EU Parliament from memory, from last week. Was sort of really, I can't remember the phrase he used. I want to say stand up, but maybe it was to wake up. But he was certainly urging Europe to stop being, I guess, subordinated to American objectives.
Right. Well, it was in response to Ursula von Leyen had said, and this was after not the Trump-Zelensky debacle, but the phone conversation that Trump and Putin had, which we have yet to get the transcript of that. I would pay good money to read the transcript of that phone conversation, because Trump says a number of things which, I kind of, take it at the fact that it's Trump. The Kremlin has been very quiet about what was said. Both Putin and Lavrov they've been holding the cards close to their hands here. But that conversation was what led to Ursula von der Leyen to say, this is a wake-up call for Europe, which my response, among others, was, lady, you've been given a wake-up call for the last 30 years. You've had plenty of opportunities. Instead, you just simply march lockstep and, with the United States, still thinking that it's 1996. Right, still thinking that Russia can be, pushed into a corner if we have one more group of sanctions. It's like the slot machine. What was I say? Sort of like the slot machine's dilemma. One more pull and I can get the jackpot. One more pull and I can get one more round of sanctions and we can finally, bring Russia to its knees. One more color revolution and we can finally produce an uprising that will topple Putin's government. People tend to think that Putin is this sole surviving czar that is running Russia. I mean, this is not the case at all. In order to understand Russia, in order to read Russia right, one needs to understand that Putin is the head of what is known as a siloviki, right? A group of people that run the country almost as if it's like an organized criminal syndicate, which I know already stigmatizes it as Russia is a mafia state. Forget the whole organized crime. Just look at the way a mafia is run. It is run by a council of people at the top that have all the say. This is how Russia is run. It is a security state through and through. And so the only way for minds to change within the EU would be for leadership to change. But to go back to the original part of this question, and I had already mentioned this idea of liberalism being an ideology. This is the curse of liberalism, is that it's an ideology that weds you to a belief that what you are doing on the world stage has a noble mission, that there is a greater cause, right? Liberalism locks a country into engaging with something around the world because something has to be done. Something has to be done about Ukraine. Something has to be done, right, about Bosnia. Something has to be done about something over there. And if we don't do it, right, evil will prevail. It's interesting how they are so wedded to something needs to be done in Ukraine, and they have said little to nothing beyond rhetorical statements about what's happening in Palestine. Right. So, Sachs is somebody who I have enormous amount of respect for. And what's interesting about Jeffrey Sachs is that 35 years ago, he wrote an article in The Economist in January of 1990, right, shortly after the euphoria of the Berlin Wall opening and the single-party communist regimes collapsing in Eastern Europe. And it really was sort of a Monday morning, now what, coming to terms with reality. And the article was called, unironically, What is to be Done? Which, if you know your Russian and you know your history, right, it's connected to one of Lenin's famous essays. But in that essay, Sachs had laid out the roadmap for Eastern Europe's integration with the West. And this was the very famous shock therapy model, which, when you think about it, shock therapy produced enormous political, economic, social, and cultural repercussions throughout the post-communist world, leading us to where we are today. And so for someone like Sachs, right, an economist, well-respected economist, to, in the last number of years, have done almost a complete 180, now realizing that that was wrong, and that people like Putin and Orban and others are products of Western neoliberal hubris, does give me at least some optimism that minds can change, right? And that policies can alter, right? He has gone on record to say he has been actively involved in the 90s in setting up these emerging countries' economies, their currencies. He is well connected to the political leadership. So when he is now effectively saying that the war in Ukraine could have been avoided had NATO and the West heeded Russia's warnings and had there been a more rational sit down. This is not Russian propaganda. This is not conspiracy theory. This is not anti-Western rhetoric. This effectively confirms what Putin, Lavrov, John Mearsheimer, among others, have been saying. But it also means that the Western narrative of all of this is being predicated on Russian imperialism, Putin wanting to restart the Soviet Union. After Ukraine, Poland is next, Eastern Europe is next. I mean, this is just scare tactics. And there is no basis in reality. There's no empirical evidence that any of this exists. And it really is just a case of not only reading Russia wrong, but deliberately getting it wrong.
Yeah. I read Vladislav Zubok's book Collapse about the fall of the Soviet Union in the last year or two. And I think one of the points he makes there is, as after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev was seeking an economic package through the G7, G8 to, I guess, reconstruct the Soviet Union as effectively a social democracy. And my recollection was the total value of the package was about $100 billion. And, driven by the neocons and stuff in America and American geostrategy, the West said no. And there was, he documents the feeling of guilt and bad conscience from Bush and the Canadian Prime Minister and the German leaders, etc., about betraying Gorbachev in this way. Yeah. But when you think about what the opportunity cost of the last 30 years of conflict just in Ukraine has been compared to that moment, it's just a staggeringly visionless decision. So hopefully people can have some better vision this time round and maybe make a bit of a pivot. But one of the challenges, I guess, for Europe is around its defence strategy around NATO, because Europe is it's not just broken up into all the different nations, but I guess in a way its foreign policy, its domestic policy, and its defence policy are all sort of separately run effectively. I mean, it sort of outsources its defence to NATO, which is more about American offensive objectives, perhaps, rather than European defensive objectives. Do you think there's any in any of the talk from some of the European leaders about rearming and strengthening their defences? Do you think there's any sort of strategic redirection of how they spend their defensive money, defence budget, rather than just spending more, actually reorienting it from American offence to European defence?
I think that this is part of that wake-up call that
Yeah.
they are now experiencing, and this is especially true with Poland, with the three Baltic states, with Finland, which has now been admitted into NATO. Which, isn't it interesting that it's Ukraine is the one that is invaded? Ukraine is the one seeking membership in NATO, and two erstwhile neutral countries, Finland and Sweden, asked to get in. They're almost in like that. I mean, if I were Zelensky, if I were Zaluzhny, if I were just an ordinary Ukrainian, I would begin to realize that this is once again not what it seems. Of course, I also love how NATO's response to Ukraine is: you can get into NATO when you have defeated Russia on the battlefield. I mean,
Yeah. I mean,
right then and there,
I feel that was evident in Zelensky's reaction to Vance, saying you should be grateful because, you know, we've given you all this money and now you just have to pay it back and you should be grateful. But, you know, we haven't
should be grateful
given you,
that you've survived this
admitted
long.
you to NATO, and, you know, it's only however many 100,000 people of your citizens have died.
I think the big question ultimately is, if Europe is going to increase its defense spending, and they realize also, right, that there's a possibility, and I don't know how likely the possibility, but the thing with Trump is that anything is a possibility with Trump. Anything is a possibility. He may consider cutting NATO loose. He may consider withdrawing from NATO because it is it's a drain on American resources. It gives the United States too much of a tether with other countries. Now, let's just entertain this scenario in which Trump either withholds NATO funding or withdraws altogether, right? And some of the real hardcore, MAGA Republicans are even calling for the United States to withdraw from the UN. And a part of me, the little doomer Marxist that I am, I almost applaud that, because it would have finally allowed Palestine to be admitted as the 194th state, and suddenly Israel no longer has its cover. But it's another story for another time. But I do believe that certain countries will, because they already have, increase their budget for defense spending. Poland is effectively going to be the most armed country on the eastern flank. The UK is in a strange situation because it's no longer in the EU. It tries to speak with an independent voice for NATO, but Starmer is not popular, and Labor is trying to find something, anything, to give it a label. Knowing that if the polls hold the way that they are, Farange's Reform Party is currently the most popular, which he will not be able to form a government. But it does say much about voter frustration with the ways that we've been doing things. This has also been reflected in AfD coming in second place in German parliamentary elections. They will not form a government, but it shows the growing dissent among these things. So for countries to justify increased defense spending, for countries to continue to advocate the idea of boots on the ground in Ukraine, for picking up the slack for America's withdrawal, or maybe even escalating the conflict with Russia in order to give Ukraine better leverage at the negotiating table. And this is what I said last weekend with my discussion with Piotr and James. And I said, look, as an American, it's something I'll be damned if World War III begins because Lithuania wants to do something against Kaliningrad just to force Russia's hand. I mean, I will be damned if the Baltics do something that insane. If this happens, I don't see how this is a long-term strategy for Europe. I don't see how they can sustain themselves. again, the best way forward, and it's not popular among the liberalists, right, is to find a pragmatic solution with Russia that gives Ukraine as much saving grace as possible, and one in which Ukraine does not have to sign over its raw materials and minerals, its economic sustainability as a peace agreement.
And look, in some ways, it seems to me that's more. It's Ukraine has a more viable path with the EU than with America. I mean, in the end, both EU and the Russia are Ukraine's neighbours, and I don't know how many million Ukrainians now sort of reside in the EU, but it's an awful lot. When the war ends and Ukraine is in a pitiful state, whatever territory it controls, I can't imagine more Ukrainians aren't going to go to more prosperous, more socially functional places.
Right.
It seems to me that one of Europe's concerns surely has got to be we have this total wreck of a place on our doorstep that we're in hock for, and there's like just admitting them to the EU is going to cause enormous economic tensions within the member states. So Europe has an enduring interest and a real practical involvement in actually managing the peace, whatever that peace is in Ukraine. So I actually can't see how America can negotiate a peace in Ukraine without EU to some degree. So in some ways, I almost feel Trump is pursuing a strategy that might make sense from that logic of what you're saying of, you know, the great powers get together and sort it out amongst themselves. But in effect, he's pursuing a strategy that simply is going to fail because he doesn't have, he doesn't have the people who are part of the solution, which is Ukraine and the EU, as well as Russia involved. What do you think about that?
Russia's whole position on this, Putin and Lavrov have been asked, what do you have to say about Europe lamenting that they're not part of this peace deal? And the answers usually fall into two categories, and that is, well, Europe lost its rights. Europe lost all bargaining rights years ago when they were brought to the table. They agreed to something, and then as soon as the photos were taken and everybody went home, the agreements were not implemented. They were not honored. So Europe cannot be trusted. But more to the point, they can't be trusted because they're basically being told what to do by the United States. And so in that regard, right, let the big kids handle it, at least initially. And then the smaller kids, the smaller partners can work with what's been structurally put together. The other one is that Putin sees negotiations with the United States, with Trump, as bilateral relations. Right? This has nothing to do with Europe. This is a Washington-Moscow arrangement, which includes, among other things, Ukraine. If Europe wants to get on board after that, they are absolutely welcome to do so. But if they have an alternative proposal, they, like Trump said to Zelensky, you don't have the cards. You don't hold the leverage. You're effectively making demands without any leverage, without any kind of legitimacy. So to demand that, let's say, Russia give up all of its territory, that Ukraine goes back to the borders of 1991, is just not going to happen, short of a full-scale invasion. But this is something that I agree with my colleague James Kurlindsey on. He's definitely more of a liberalist. I'm more of a constructivist. But I mean, I absolutely respect his opinions and his views. He is well qualified in what he says. The big thing is that Ukraine's sovereignty, its borders, are at stake. If this were just simply a case of Russia invades, regime changes Kiev, but the borders remain the same, this is business as usual. The United States does regime change all the time. It's sort of become just a thing that great powers do. But to annex territory in Ukraine's east and south, on top of Russia annexing Crimea, any deal that results in a reduced Ukrainian state now opens up all kinds of possibilities for Me Too movements around the world. And this is what I feel, and I agree with James on.
Sorry, when you say Me Too movements, I don't.
Me Too. I'm sorry. I know. I guess it's sort of a Me Too, not in the hashtag Me Too movement, but sort of if this can happen here, it can happen here. You know, our secessionist movement should have just as much legitimacy.
Sure.
If we recognize Ukraine's loss of territory, why should we not recognize Georgia's loss? And Serbia is looking at this with extreme nervousness because it's, again, ironic that the very powers that are calling for Ukraine to be kept whole are insisting that Kosovo is an independent state, are insisting that Serbia recognize Kosovo's loss if it wants to get into the European Union. The Kosovo precedent is something that Russia has used and has used quite well to its advantage. And arguments from the West saying you can't compare Kosovo with other cases, Kosovo's a special case. Says who? Right? Says who? It's a special case because they say that it is. It's like a kid on the playground that doesn't have a better counter argument to do-it-yourself rules and says, well, that just doesn't count. That's a special case. That doesn't count. Might makes right, unfortunately, and it does count. So if Ukraine is forced to cede territory, will Ukraine be forced to recognize it? Will the West recognize it? Will this go into some disputed, frozen conflict for the foreseeable future, for future generations to kick the can down the road? I mean, this is ultimately the reason why the EU is so nervous about Trump cutting a deal with Russia, because with the United States in Europe's corner, right, this could at best remain a frozen conflict. With the United States now willing to re-engage with Russia, as a way of shutting this one conflict down to then open up something else with China, leaves the EU, leaves Europe in a bind, and leaves a lot of people in the United States that had previously supported the old foreign policy in a bind, because this now completely resets everything. What will happen in 4 years? Let's say Trump is done after 4 years, and a Democrat comes back in. Will we be able to go back to where we were? No, we won't. Right? No, we won't. So the damage is going to be done now, and the reality is going to be set. And that's something that I always mention in my classes, especially my class on conflict resolution. Is that rule number one: reality is dictated by the most insane person in the room. And Trump loves being that insane person.
I think the historian Emmanuel Todd has said that Trump's historical sort of mission, so to speak, is to manage the defeat of the West in this sort of Ukraine conflict. His book, The Defeat of the West and stuff. But he describes he describes the nature of the American reaction as kind of an erratic response to this sort of defeat humiliation. That's his interpretation. But then he describes the response of everyone else around the world, everyone on YouTube, and everyone, all the different allies and stuff, as the humble servant trying to make sense of his erratic, abusive master and trying to give a good explanation for why he keeps beating him, sort of thing. And in Australia, Australia's like a lot of countries around the world closely allied with the US, and a lot of people around Australia are utterly appalled by, what's going on and all that sort of stuff. But wondering, well, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for US foreign policy? In a way, the dilemma that Europe's in is shared by Japan and South Korea and Australia and many places around the world, that there's not really a sort of dependable, stable, clear, and mutually sort of beneficial, I guess, relationship that seems to be operating anymore. What would be your assessment of, I guess, the lessons for, the places around the world connected with the US or intimately connected somehow or other diplomatically with the US, in responding to these sort of new inconsistent directions coming from the US foreign policy?
I think the first thing is whether or not countries like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the UK, France, Canada, basically everybody else. I think the first thing is this a temporary hiccup in which Trump is just a temporary, irritable deviation, and whether we will go back to normal after Trump, or whether this truly is a rupture, a rift. And right now, you're dealing with the aftermath of a traumatic breakup. You're dealing with the idea that the partner that you had been with for years comes out to be a full-on malignant narcissist. The mask has fallen. And you realize, was this really ever truly love? Was this ever really real? And you're telling yourself, yes, it was, because we have a long history of good partnerships, right? Obama, Clinton, Biden, even George W. Bush has been rehabilitated into the good guys. But we forget that Bush Jr. and Cheney, orchestrated an invasion of a country based on absolutely bogus pretexts. And yet they're part of they get along great with everyone else. George W. Bush and Michelle Obama sharing a cough drop at Nancy Reagan's funeral or whatever it is. Best of friends. It's wonderful. So right now, the understanding is that we have to hold the fort until America, gets its, comes back to its senses, right? So who is now going to pick up the coalition of the willing? I mean, this is, Keir Starmer's little crusade, along with, Justin Trudeau and Macron and Merz, among others. So, my guess is that for countries like, Australia, Japan, South Korea, whatever, you're going to just have to work together as some kind of, Western audience, as some Western coalition against what is perceived as the emerging great powers. And maybe this is just a temporary symptom that America will get through and everything will be fine. Or you can take this as a golden opportunity and say, even if the United States does get back on track, there needs to be an independent foreign policy. It cannot simply rely on what mood Washington is in that day. Because as an American, I can tell you, it does not matter whether we are Republican or Democrat. We have our interests, and we operate, at least rhetorically, through the principles of liberalism. But I can tell you this much: great powers always use realism. Liberalism is a nice candy coating shell to make it look somehow justified. It's what I like to call Wilsonian realism, right? Regime change for the good of the people because the government is tyrannical. Forget the fact that regime change does not produce anything better. Forget the fact that it actually causes even greater security dilemmas. and forget the fact that the people in these countries, Iraq, Libya, even Syria, will say life was unironically better under Saddam Hussein, under Muammar Gaddafi. If you actually have to say that, and you say that with full seriousness, then I really question the intention of trying to make the world safer for democracy. Because if you believe that democratic peace theory, if you believe in democratic peace theory that no two democracies go to war with each other, fantastic. So we just have to make the world more democratic. The road to perpetual peace is paved with war after war after war. What I'm trying to say here is that the United States has not all of a sudden changed course under Trump. We have just been more belligerent. The mask has fallen off, but the mask was worn quite well by Biden and Obama and others. We have to remember Biden green-lighted state-sponsored genocide in the Middle East. All of these people that are aghast at us treating Zelensky wrong, all of us that are aghast at how we could possibly question Zelensky's wardrobe, say little to nothing about the fact that genocide in our time, openly, unapologetically, has been orchestrated against a people and is still going on. Trump has also made it very clear that if he got his way, he would turn Gaza into Mar-a-Lago 2.0. Has anybody really been that shocked? People are more shocked at the Trump video yelling at Zelensky than the AI video that he posted on his Twitter page about what he would do in Gaza, with an AI image of him and Netanyahu sitting on the beach drinking a Mai Tai or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
So I really have to wonder where this indignation is coming from, unless it is just simply the idea that Ukraine is like Zelensky, not a country, but an avatar, but a symbol against Russia, which no matter what is considered to be the arch enemy of European Western liberalism. I know that many people are going to say that simply mentioning Russophobia is a cop-out, but it's real. It's absolutely real. And it has nothing to do with people being upset that no one likes Russian culture or Russian history. It's a policy. It's a foreign policy. It's a domestic policy that is used to justify extremely self-interested and highly destructive policies. I like to throw out a number of books to recommend. Glenn Deason wrote a book a number of years ago called Russophobia. It's a phenomenal work. Deason is sort of persona non grata in many Western academic circles because he's seen as in Russia's camp. He's not, right? He is not. Sachs is not in Russia's camp. Mearsheimer is not in Russia's camp. But just simply deviating from the prescripted norm that Ukraine good, Russia bad, Putin evil, Zelensky wonderful. We have to just keep this war going because eventually we'll bring Russia to its knees, has destroyed an entire country, has halved the population. And those Ukrainians that made it to Europe, they're not going to go back to Ukraine. They have no intention of going back to Ukraine. We have basically destroyed the sovereignty of a country to what? Make a point that we still haven't made, to win an argument that we still haven't won?
Yeah, it's truly shocking, really, isn't it? Yeah, Glenn's work is fantastic. I haven't read the Russophobia book, but there's a book, a history book called The Russia Anxiety by Mark B. Smith, which I certainly recommend on my channel, which in a way, he actually presents a whole alternative narrative of Russian history to help deal with Russophobia, which people really might want to read. One last question. I mean, there's this talk about Trump doing a, Kissinger moment of, switching to, closing down the war in Russia and starting up a war in China, which, scares many people in Australia for sure. Do you think that is at all viable? Do you think there's that level of sophistication and coherence or ability to execute such a strategy in America at the moment?
No, but he's certainly going to try. I mean, if we've learned one thing about Trump 2.0 in the last, month and a half, is that he'll try anything and see what sticks to the wall. And if it sticks, great. And if it doesn't, it keeps people guessing. It keeps people scrambling. It keeps people, responding. What will he do as far as a trade war with China? Will he start a military conflict? I don't foresee anything in terms of using the military, just because, again, military is bad for business. But reorganizing some kind of trade deal and some kind of economic arrangement, in his mind, whatever it is probably what he's going to do. The thing is that the United States, even economically speaking, no longer has the clout to determine what the rest of the world does. And I'm sure that someone has told him that the largest holder of US debt is China. So if you want to go after the Chinese economy and tank it, you do, of course, know that China will take the United States with it. So good luck, really good luck on that. Also, I know that there's lots of talk in the West about Europe wanting to get China to side against Russia, America wanting to get Russia to side against China. It doesn't work like that anymore. No. One thing that has happened in the last 3 years is that Russian-Chinese relations have become as close and as intertwined as possible. Both are key members of BRICS. Both are key members of Shanghai Cooperation. And Putin has said repeatedly that China is the emerging world power. If there is a multipolar world, which he acknowledges, there is a sort of a pecking order. China is number one. The United States is number two. And Russia is just seeking to be a number three, with India, Iran, and others playing out whether you want to be 4, 5, and 6. So to suggest that Trump is somehow going to succeed against China is something that I would love to see, but I don't want to see at the same time.
Yeah. I guess the irony, I've just been reading a book about the China during this period, and I guess one of the ironies is the Kissinger moment was not really the way perhaps Henry Kissinger has told the story for 50 years since the moment. And to some degree, it almost emerged mercurially or accidentally out of misunderstandings from America and China and all the rest of it. I mean, Mao was actually seriously worried about the Soviet Union invading China, and that's kind of what he wanted to do. So sometimes delusions lead to new realities, and perhaps that's what will happen with Donald Trump as well.
Yeah.
It's been a wonderful conversation, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me. And do you want to just mention perhaps your YouTube channel and what sort of work you do there as well for any viewers who haven't met you before on the internet?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, Jeff. I think it was a great hour-long conversation, and hope to be back as well. My page, Michael Rossi Poli-Sci, it started out as, and it still does, as a way for me to put my courses that I teach within political science, primarily within comparative politics and international relations, sort of up online in the name of public scholarship. And so some of my earlier works were literally a video camera in my classroom, teaching this stuff. So that kind of has helped a lot of students around the world. And, I'm veering very slowly into full-on public scholarship. At some point, I may just walk away from institutionalized academia altogether. Still in the business here, but over the last 3 years, I also offered a number of videos primarily by Vladimir Putin and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, just translating the subtitles underneath, because a lot of these videos are not translated. They are available on, Russian websites, but the transcripts might be available in English, but to have them while you're listening is something else. And a lot of these videos oftentimes have the voiceovers, the real live voiceovers that many people find sort of discordant. And they're just in small snippets rather than the entire video. So it's primarily for primary source material. Take it however way that you will. It's especially that YouTube has severely limited the amount of material from this. I do it. It is not monetized. It is not by anything. I'm not making any money off of this, so I've come to this modus vivendi with YouTube in that I, provide this, and it's simply for public. It's a public service more than anything else. But I also I'm now increasingly on other channels like yours and Piotr's Geopolitics and Pascal Notaroz's
Pascal's channel,
neutrality studies. He's a great guy. I've had wonderful opportunities to speak with him. Weeb Union is also a channel that does day-to-day updates on the war in Ukraine. All of them have reached out to me, which is always nice. And I've developed a good working relationship with them. And many of them have become colleagues of mine. So I'm happy to have met you, Jeff. And I hope that we can have, continued conversations about not just Ukraine, but just about making sense of the world here in 2025.
That'd be wonderful. And I know I watched a video of yours from a couple of weeks ago, which was your sort of geopolitical guide to 2025. I can't quite remember what it was, but
that was basically it. Yeah,
I'll include a link in the video description for people as well. So I would really recommend people maybe view that next, because it's about 90 minutes, but it's actually an incredibly concise summary of an enormous range of issues going on in the world at the moment. So it's better than watching, 90 minutes of the Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky show, perhaps. Thank you so much for joining me, Michael.
Thank you, Jeff. I hope to see you again soon.